Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today is day number 30 and final day in my January 2025 focus month on 60s, 70s, 80s, new age, ambient, experimental, and electronic space rock uh, focus month. It's sort of fitting I end the month on this review. In some ways, this is Manuel Göttsching's 1984 album, originally recorded in 1981, album called E2-E4. So it's kind of fitting that this, I didn't plan it this way, but it's kind of fitting that this album be the last one I review in this focus month on 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s experimental electronic music. This kind of bridges the gap between the past and the future in a lot of respect. Um, it's kind of using 70s equipment in kind of a new way, in a sort of evolving way from like Steve Reich and sort of minimalist that sort of did that, and it sort of is the precursor or maybe even the foundation for a lot of the styles that we know most when it comes to electronic music these days, which is like ones that are related to dance music. In many ways, this album helped spawn house music and techno music in a deeper respect. It's been sampled and used countless amount of times, and it was really made popular in the late 80s in the dance community for a group called Sueno Latino in self-titled album, self-titled track, taking the the essence of this album and turning it into a ambient house or techno track in many respects. Of course, Manuel Göttsching was in Ashra Temple, the experimental electronic band in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and pretty much he was in that band till he passed away in 2022 at the age of 70. But he also played with Klaus Schultz and collaborated with him quite a bit as well, and Michael Honing as well from Tangerine Dream. One thing that I find interesting about this album is the name of the album, E2E4. So as obviously you can tell from the artwork, the iconic artwork, that it's obviously chess related, the game chess. And I find the name interesting because for two reasons. E2 E4 is known as the King's Pawn opening move, which in in chess is important because it gives white the control of the center of the board, and it also opens up the development for the pieces. Right, it's one of white's most popular and aggressive opening moves, and I find that interesting for two reasons. First off, when you think of aggressive moves in any kind of like board game or chess or something like that, you would think the farther or the most the farthest or the most uh, aggressive move would be towards the enemy, right? You think that would be more most aggressive, but actually it's subliminal in the fact that you're only moving the piece one piece and not two pieces. For a pawn, you only have those. Obviously, you only have those two decisions on moving, starting out the game, and so it's aggressive, but it's not really aggressive, right? Because it's not the farther move or the more aggressive move per se, but it is. If you know chess, it actually is the most aggressive um, because it's more hidden. So it's passive aggressive, which is really important into layering your strategy in chess. And I'm not the best at chess. In fact, I'm not great at chess at all. But um, that part I feel like I know from playing chess over the years and getting my butt kicked in it. But then the second reason I find it interesting is because it aligns with the music, right? When you think of that move, it's just a simple move, but it opens up everything else and for everything else to develop. And that's what this album is a landmark in doing. And it's got some simple ideas, but everything is developed outside of that and evolving and mutating into basically a 59-minute long epic one track that's really just pretty much evolving in almost every instrument is evolving in some way or another in different parts of the song and in unique ways. And that's really the importance of this album. It takes minimalism to a new decade or a new generation in many respects. There's certainly a New York sort of Latin club rhythms in here and sort of Latin feel to the percussion and the island sort of percussion. And there's nothing groundbreaking with that and nothing really groundbreaking with the minimalism because Steve Reich and Teddy Riley and other minimalist performers through the 60s and 70s have really, they're certainly important for that. But this has and maybe it's because of the combination of the Latin percussion and sort of the beachy sort of sound, and maybe combined with the '80s sort of electro, and maybe a little bit of techno in here, and sort of like the analog feel and just the sounds themselves. Also, guitar playing on here and just the effects in general and the equipment used. It's all kind of combining to give the album the the impact that it had. Again, this is sort of like a landmark of minimalisms in a way, analog, sampled so many times by electronic artists. Again, just countless of people have sampled this album, especially specifically in the post rave, chill out, ambient house, techno, and other styles of dance music. Just even just the bird chirping, the sort of bird sound is iconic in electronic music, and it comes from this album. Um, but it's groundbreaking for being one consistent track and just the evolution of it. It sounds simple, but for 1981 when this was done, that was pretty revolutionary. And then on top of it, it included a beat, and it included guitar, and it included all these great instruments. It was just kind of everything kind of came together here. But I think probably the most important thing for me about this album is how to, in a minimalistic way, how to evolve certain tones to where they become, or certain sounds or instruments till they evolve them in such a way to where it becomes repetitive, but it evolves enough to where it's interesting enough. And I think that's what's so important about this album is it get pa- it gets past that feeling of monotonous, and it still is interesting. Um, I think with a lot of artists that tried to do this in the past, they would get to the point where like, okay, this sounds repetitive. I feel like I have to evolve this, and they sort of change, and you're like, oh, if they would have done that a little bit more and really kind of honed that rhythm in and stuff like that, it could have been something. If you're into more of the experimental stuff like I am, and there's so many producers that sort of had gotten to that point, and some of them definitely a lot of them achieve that to a certain extent, but not to the point where it's a 59-minute track and you're evolving certain parts to where they're still interesting, um, and sort of evolving with each other, and other parts are evolving in other ways and other uh, cycles as they sort of work themselves out in kind of a experimental way. And I think that's the importance of the album for me. Because of the sounds, because of being one consistent track, I didn't necessarily rate the individual tracks themselves. I think for a piece like this, it's really important to evolve. or score the album based on the evolution of the album and the overall of the album. That may seem kind of obvious, but I generally do like to rate the songs to give me an idea to more accurately rate the album. But on this one, I feel pretty strongly about giving. I mean, it's obviously in some ways minimalism and new age and electronic music. It's a classic, and it's hard to really it's hard to really argue that point. There's more that supports that than to argue that point. So it's almost like a precursor to give this album at least an 80, and for it to be a classic of the electronic music genre, especially for 80s. But it's so important for the rest of everything that came after it, more so than probably any other 80s album that I can think of. When it comes to what I've grown to love in the 90s and the last 30, 35 years from this. So it's easy to give it an 80. I almost feel like giving it the 90s, but I feel like I can't quite put it there for me personally. But overall, it's obviously a super strong album and a classic album of minimalism. And I gave it an 84 out of 100. Obviously, a really strong album. And it's really, again, it's fitting that I closed this month and my focus month on 60s, 70s, and electronic music with this album. Yeah, Manuel Göttsching's 1984 album, E2-E4. I'm curious what you guys think of this album, if you guys have heard it. What do you guys think about the importance of it if you do know it? And then also, I'm curious if anybody knows why it was recorded in 1981 and wasn't released till 1984. I couldn't find anything about that and the reason why that is, but I'm curious to know why it was delayed 3 years because I think it's important to know that was made in 1981, even more so than 1984. Even though it's just 3 years, it's those are an important 3 years in electronic music. But yeah, that's my overall thoughts on E2 E4 by Manuel Göttsching. All right, thanks so much.
Electric Cafe.